While my mother-in-law, Stephanie, helped my husband's mistress choose which $3,500 designer heels looked more lovely, I was on the phone, canceling the black card she worshipped. She believed our Upper East Side brownstone was her son's legacy, oblivious that the deed and every credit line she flashed had my name on them. By the time their bags hit the counter, the transaction was already declined. My revenge was the only thing she would never be able to put on my tab. Welcome to Narratives by Nora channel. I'm out on the road today, thinking about how some people treat kindness like an unlimited credit line. Before we see this family's world collapse, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I'll dive into your stories as soon as I pull over. Now, let's get back to that ice-cold brownstone in Manhattan. The air in our Manhattan brownstone always carried a certain Arctic chill. It did not matter that the outside world was simmering in a New York summer. Inside, everything was kept at a crisp, clinical 68 degrees. It smelled of expensive beeswax candles and the suffocating scent of mahogany polish. This was a stage where I performed the role of Madison, the docile wife, the woman who smiled through silent dinners and nodded while Adam discussed his latest strategic moves in the real estate world. To Adam and his mother, Stephanie, I was a quiet convenience. I was the girl with a vague remote job who had been lucky enough to marry into the prestigious Bishop lineage. I was a background character in their grand production. But beneath the soft cardigans and the compliant smiles, I lived a different life. In the quiet hours when they were out spending my resources, I was the architect of an empire. I was the founder and chief executive officer of the city's most aggressive architectural firm. I built the skyline they looked at from their windows. I had spent years perfecting this masterpiece of deception, not because I loved the lies, but because I had seen how fragile Adam's ego truly was. Early in our marriage, even a hint of my success made him shrink. He felt emasculated by a woman who could out-earn and out-plan him. I had a bulletproof prenuptial agreement that kept my business assets separate, which was why Adam was so desperate to forge my name on that loan he knew he couldn't touch my empire in a divorce. So, I built a prison of my own making. I let him put his name on the mailbox. I let Stephanie believe her son was the titan providing this life. I allowed myself to become a ghost in my own hallways, watching them treat my hard-earned assets as their birthright. Every piece of furniture, every light fixture, and the very air conditioning they relied on were line items on my personal balance sheet. They lived in a museum of my accomplishments. Yet they treated me like the help. I was the one who signed the paychecks for the staff they berated. I was the one who insured the cars they crashed. I sat at our dining table, watching the city lights shimmer like a spilled jewelry box against the velvet night, knowing that I owned the box, the jewelry, and the velvet. And they had no idea that the silent partner was about to call in the debt. I watched Adam walk toward the bedroom, his eyes already glued back to the screen of his phone. He did not even notice the smudge of sauce on his shirt or the way the silence in the room seemed to vibrate with my unspoken truth. I had spent years being the silent investor in their version of family. It was not just the brownstone or the credit cards. It was the emotional and financial salvage work I performed in the shadows. 2 years ago, when Adam lost $250,000 in a reckless real estate gamble he had no business taking, I was the one who cleared the debt before his mother ever found out. I did it because I believed in the contract of our marriage. I did it because I was still trying to buy the love I thought was waiting for me at the end of every sacrifice. When Stephanie wanted to maintain the illusion of being a prominent donor to the Children's Hospital charity, it was my bank account that covered the $100,000 donation. I had been funding a lifestyle that cost me over $120,000 every single month, all to protect the ego of a man who refused to grow. My compassion had become a luxury they had overdrafted for years. I kept wondering what I had ever done wrong to deserve their disdain, but the answer was always the same. I was too useful to be loved and too capable to be respected. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from playing small so someone else can feel big. I had built a prison without bars for myself, a psychological cage where every achievement of mine had to be muffled so it would not shatter Adam's fragile sense of masculinity. I remember when I was 26, I had just landed a contract for the new downtown library. It was the biggest win of my career. But when I told Adam, he did not celebrate. He just looked at his hands and asked if that meant I would be working even later. I saw the resentment flicker in his eyes, and instead of standing my ground, I apologized. I apologized for my own brilliance. That was the moment the invisible chain tightened. I learned to hide the accolades. I learned to let him think his networking brought in the clients my algorithms were actually securing. This was not just compliance. It was a survival strategy in a household that viewed my success as a threat to the natural order. Back then, I believed that if I just supported him enough, he would eventually see me. Now I realized that love was a subscription service, and I was the only one paying the bill. Adam always thought he was the financial genius, so he never questioned why I insisted on married filing separately. I told him it was to protect the Bishop prestige from any potential liabilities of my small design firm. In reality, it kept his greedy eyes off my multi-million-dollar tax returns and the vast architectural empire he thought was just a work-from-home hobby. I was a survivor of a dynamic that demanded I be a ghost in my own hallways. But a ghost does not have a signature on a deed. A ghost does not have the power to deactivate a lifestyle. I was finally waking up to the fact that I was not the guest in this house. I was the architect. The front door of the brownstone slammed open, the sound echoing through the foyer like a gunshot. I stayed in the dining room, finishing my wine. I did not need to see them to know they were here. The air shifted, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the frantic energy of people who had just been told no for the first time in their lives. Stephanie marched in, her face a violent shade of red. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not apologize for the heels. She just slammed her purse onto the mahogany table. "Madison, we have a crisis," she barked, her voice shrill with an indignation she had clearly spent the entire car ride rehearsing. "The bank is having some sort of massive systematic failure. Every single card was declined at the boutique." Adam followed her, looking more annoyed than concerned. He looked tired. His designer shirt was wrinkled, and the arrogance that usually defined his posture was replaced by a twitching impatience. "It was embarrassing," he said, using that tone he usually reserved for a disobedient child. "I had to stand there while a shop girl looked at us like we were broke. You need to call the private banking line right now. This is a disgrace to the Bishop name." I looked at them, my expression carefully neutral. I was an architect of systems, and I was watching their internal logic fail in real time. I was not the weeping wife they expected. I was not the girl trying to earn her mother-in-law's approval with beef stew. I was the chief executive officer of my own life, and I had just identified a massive liability. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. "A glitch?" I asked, my voice calm, almost bored. "That is unusual. I will look into it when I have time." "When you have time?" Stephanie scoffed, her gold bracelets clinking against her crystal glass like a warning bell as she poured herself more wine. "We do not have time. We are hosting a welcome party for a critical investor on Saturday. Her name is Destiny. She represents a significant opportunity for the family firm. I have already booked the catering. It is $8,500. I need the cards restored before the deposit is due tomorrow morning." The irony was staggering. I knew exactly who Destiny was. I had the photos from the private investigator in the next room. They were not just using my money to fund Adam's affair. They were demanding I pay for the official celebration of my own replacement. They saw me as a wallet with a pulse, a line item on their schedule that had stopped performing. There was no remorse in their eyes, only the frustration of a master whose servant had suddenly forgotten her place. I realized they were not even capable of guilt because they did not see me as a person. I was a financial utility, a subscription service that had suddenly buffered. To them, my only value was the liquidity I provided. They sat at my table, eating my food, and plotted my disposal while asking me to pay for the party. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. "I will see what I can do," I said, standing up. I did not tell them the cards were not broken. I did not tell them the bank was not failing. I was simply auditing the budget, and their time was running out. I walked out of the room, the silence following me like a shadow. The 48th floor of the Mitchell Architectural Group headquarters felt like a different planet. Here, the air was filtered and cool, carrying the faint hum of servers rather than the scent of beeswax and deception. The glass walls offered a similar view of Manhattan, but from here, the city looked like a series of data points and blueprints rather than a collection of social obligations. I sat behind my desk, a sprawling expanse of black obsidian that served as the command center for my empire. To Adam and Stephanie, I was Madison, the wife who dabbled in design. Here, I was the architect of a fintech integrated real estate ecosystem that moved billions of dollars across the skyline. I had already initiated Project Zero Balance. I did not cry when I saw the data points aligning on my monitors. I did not ask why. I simply opened my secure server and started clicking through the audit. I was no longer the weeping wife. I was a CEO managing a high-stakes corporate siege. My fury had distilled into a cold, calculated strategy. It was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about a surgical extraction of every privilege I had ever granted them. I was a data analyst at heart, and I did not look away from anomalies. I investigated them. My private investigator sat across from me, his face illuminated by the blue light of my 3 wall-mounted monitors. He did not ask me to pick up his dry cleaning. He did not critique my Navy power suit. He simply handed me a leather folder. "Stephanie has been busy, Madison," he said. "It was not just the heels of the boutique. She has been leveraging your credit to build a fortress for the girl." I drilled down into the raw data, my eyes scanning the merchant IDs and timestamps. This month, the expenditure curve was erratic, showing sharp peaks that did not align with Stephanie's usual retail therapy. I saw a charge for $45,000 at an elite interior design firm, another for $12,000 at a high-end appliance gallery. But the data point that made my blood turn to ice was the address listed on the delivery invoices, 1210 10th Avenue. My stomach gave a lurch of physical reaction that my logical brain tried to suppress. That address was not just any building. It was the Sovereign, the flagship glass needle I had spent 3 years designing. It was my masterpiece, a skyscraper that was supposed to be the jewel of my professional legacy. Stephanie was not just funding a Mistress. She was using my credit lines to pay for a prepaid 5-year lease and a full interior redesign for Destiny's new nest inside my own flagship project. The total unauthorized investment was nearing $500,000. They were sitting in my buildings, drinking champagne I paid for, and planning a life that required my disposal. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. But a war is won by cutting off the enemy's supply lines, and Adam and Stephanie had no supply lines of their own. They only had the ones I provided. I looked at the photos of Unit 4210. It was already being outfitted with the custom marble I had hand-selected for the building. They were trying to play the big man with my blueprints. I reached for my desk phone and dialed the priority banking line. I did not hesitate. "I need to make an immediate change to the primary account," I said, my voice as hard as the steel beams of my skyscraper. "I believe there has been a massive security breach. I need you to decline every incoming transaction starting now. Audit the Bishop accounts, flag them for fraud, and initiate a total liquidation of all non-performing assets." The investigator leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that cut through the hum of the server room. "It gets worse, Madison. This is not just about a mistress and a fancy apartment. Stephanie is not just grooming Destiny to be the new Mrs. Bishop. She is paying off a debt." I looked at the documents he slid across my obsidian desk. They were records of private, high-interest loans taken out by Stephanie's late husband that she had tried to hide for years. She was drowning in debt to a man named Marcus Cole, Destiny's father. The logic of the betrayal finally made a sickening kind of sense. Stephanie was not just being a supportive mother to an unfaithful son. She was a woman cornered. She had brokered a deal with Marcus Cole to marry Adam off to his daughter. By merging the families, Stephanie's debt would be erased, and Destiny would secure a position in a real estate empire she believed was owned by the Bishops. They were selling me out to pay for a ghost of a legacy. "But there is more," the investigator said, tapping a specific page in the folder. "I found this in the public records for a shell company Adam set up 6 months ago. It is a loan application for $250,000. I stared at the page. My name was at the bottom, written in a confident, flowing script, but I had never seen this document in my life. I looked closer at the signature. It was a mirror of my own, but the loop of the M was a fraction too wide, and the pressure on the ink was all wrong. He didn't just forge a signature. He had unearthed a limited power of attorney I'd signed years ago for an emergency during a high-risk pregnancy. He abused a legal ghost from our past to bypass the bank's notary requirements, thinking I'd never check the archives. Adam had not just been cheating. He had been a criminal. He had forged my name on a $250,000 loan to keep his mother's secrets and his mistress's lifestyle afloat, while I was at the office, building the very money he was stealing. A cold, hollow feeling settled in the center of my chest. This was the kill shot. I had looked for a reason to feel regret, but now there was only clinical clarity. This was not a family dispute anymore. It was a felony. Adam had not just wanted a mistress. He had wanted to steal my legacy to fund his mother's lies. My compassion had been a resource they did not just spend, they forged it. I sat back in my leather chair, the light from the city below reflecting in the darkened glass of my windows. There was no more path to redemption for them. No apology could fix forgery. No tears could erase a conspiracy to replace me with the daughter of a creditor. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of chess, but they had forgotten who built the board. I closed the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a gavel striking a block. It was time to end the performance. I was not just a wife or a bankroll anymore. I was the institution, and I was about to call in the security. Call the board, I told my assistant through the intercom, and invite Adam and Stephanie to my private suite. I wanted them surrounded by my legal team and forensic accountants, a tribunal of experts who would document every penny of their theft. Tell them there is a new investment we need to discuss. I offered a cold, final smile to the city skyline. The audit was complete, and the Bishop family was about to face a total market collapse. The boardroom on the 48th floor was a cage of glass and silence. I sat at the head of the obsidian table, the city of Manhattan sprawled behind me like a map of my own design. I had been in this room 1,000 times, negotiating deals that moved the very ground this building stood on, but this was the first time I was inviting the wreckage of my personal life into my professional sanctuary. When the heavy doors opened at precisely 10 in the morning, Adam and Stephanie walked in. They were still wearing the mask of the Bishop legacy, but it was starting to crack. Stephanie looked around the room, her eyes searching for someone in charge, someone she could manipulate. Adam looked confused, his hand reaching out to adjust a tie that was no longer perfectly pressed. Madison, what is this? Adam asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. I thought you said we were meeting with the board to discuss a new investment for the firm. Why are you sitting there? I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, heavy and clinical. I watched as Stephanie tried to find a seat at the far end of the table, only to realize that every chair except the two directly across from me was already occupied by my legal team and forensic accountants. I tapped the crystal nameplate on the desk. Madison Mitchell, founder, chief executive officer. The realization hit Adam first. I saw the blood leave his face as he stared at the letters. You own this? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The whole thing? I built it, Adam, I said, my voice cold and hard. While you were out playing strategic consultant, I was the one ensuring the foundations were solid. I brought you here today to complete the audit. I slid a thick black folder across the table. It was the final report on Project Zero Balance. For 5 years, you believed you were the provider. You believed the $45,000 deposited into your account every month was a return on your brilliance. It was not. It was a spousal stipend. Legally, you were not an employee or an investor. You were a dependent, a line item under miscellaneous expenses. Stephanie let out a sharp, jagged gasp. This is an outrage. You trapped my son. You used your money to humiliate us. I looked at her with a distant, cool pity. It was time for the finisher. Humiliation is what happens when you forge my signature on a $250,000 loan to pay off your secret debts to Marcus Cole, I said, sliding the forensic evidence toward her. And as of 9 a.m., this morning, I have initiated a total liquidation. The brownstone is mine. The cars are being recovered. Your status, Stephanie, was never an heirloom. It was a subscription, and I've just canceled the service. I realized in that moment that their entire identity was an illusion of power from an empty wallet. Their breeding and class were merely a rented persona paid for by my brilliance. They had spent years mocking the very hand that fed them, oblivious to the fact that power is not a last name. It is the person who decides when the account closes. I stood up, zipping my briefcase. I've leased a small place in Mesquite for you. You can move there and live on the tiny stipend I'll provide in exchange for your silence and a signed confession, or you can stay here and wait for the NYPD to arrive with the forgery charges. Your choice. You have 7 days to move your personal effects to a 2-bedroom apartment in Mesquite, I told them. The Bishop legacy ends here. I am no longer a bankroll. I am a market correction. I walked out of the room, leaving them sitting in the glass cage of their own making. The 7th day arrived with the hollow, shuffling sound of cardboard sliding across marble as the movers cleared the final remains of the bishop's entitlement. I stood in the foyer of the brownstone, watching from the window as Adam and Stephanie climbed into a rideshare vehicle, headed for the 2-bedroom apartment in Mesquite, a life 1,000 miles away from the luxury they had tried to steal. I did not feel hate as the silver elevator doors slid shut for the last time. I only felt a distant, cool pity for 2 people who had traded their souls for a lifestyle they never earned. My eyes landed on the final supplementary black card resting on the kitchen island, a rectangle of plastic that had served as the leash that tied them to me. I picked up a pair of heavy-duty steel shears and snipped it perfectly down the middle, letting the 2 halves fall into the trash with a definitive clatter. I have come to realize that some people will only recognize your brilliance when they are trying to use it as collateral for their own lies. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that you do not need permission to exist fully, or to reclaim a narrative that others have tried to overwrite. Forgiveness is not always about reconciling with the people who hurt you. Sometimes it is simply the act of setting yourself free from the debt of their expectations. This is a letter to the outsiders, the ones who have always built legacies for people who did not deserve them. You are the architect of your own peace, and you have every right to decide when the audit is complete. If you've ever been the silent architect of someone else's success only to be treated like an afterthought, this story is for you. Like this video, subscribe for more sovereign revenge, and share your own market correction in the comments below.